This is take number 3. If you saw our first couple of attempts, we're sorry about that. Hopefully this will work. We switched our computers, and we're hopefully that'll fix some of the internet problems we're having on our end. And if it is computer, we'll be making some adjustments to that maybe in the next week or so. Hopefully, so we don't ever run into this problem again. We've been going over the last few weeks over our Old Testament University, talking about the high points of the Old Testament, some really famous stories, but trying as much as we can to show this back and forth that we see between creation and the cross, where God will make a promise to his people, some offer of a blessing, but the people come in and they don't follow, and they sin, and they go the other direction. We saw it with Cain and Abel in our first week, and certainly with Noah and Noah's Ark, and then last week with Moses. But there truthfully are a dozen, 100 different stories you could pick in the Old Testament. They all show that same thing, that back and forth between God's provision and his goodness and our inability because of our sin nature to hold on to God and to choose the right thing. And you're going to see that this week too. And what I'm really hoping for out of this particular study as we look at Joshua and the famous Battle of Jericho is again that back and forth and the tug of God towards obedience, but how there's something about us that has a way of going the wrong direction, and how that wrong direction can wreck everything. So after the death of Moses, remember Moses has led the people for 40 years. For 40 years, he's done all sorts of manner of miracles, some of the miracles that will endure in the popular imagination of the Israelites for forever. It's Moses who establishes the law. It's Moses who feeds the people with manna in the wilderness. It's Moses who gives them something to drink by speaking to or hitting a rock. It's Moses that takes them through the Red Sea and does all the plagues in Egypt. And Moses is their leader. But Moses, for all of his power and all of his great qualities, he's a living legend. With all that, it's his sin. And even in Moses' life, you see this tug between who we want to be and then who we are, and how God's pulling us to. And so Moses doesn't get to lead him into the promised land. He makes some mistakes, one big one, and he's not allowed to go in. And so after the death of Moses, God turns to Joshua and says, Moses, my servant, is dead, but you and these people are still going to go into the promised land. The promise was never tied to Moses specifically. Moses was never the power for it. It was always God. And so God says, now I'm going to do the same thing. And every place your foot touches, you're going to have that. That's the promise. But you've still got to do it. God says, I'm not going to drive them out before you get there. I'm not going to hand it over before you get there. But this will be your provision. All you've got to do is go get them. He goes on. He says, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. And I'll never leave you nor forsake you. So be strong and courageous. Which in some regard seems like an odd thing to say here. If God's going to do all that, why would Moses need to have any courage at all? And it comes back to this problem, right? I mean, the promise is there. I'll be with you every step of the way, God says, but you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to walk that walk. You're going to have to put yourself out there, knowing that I'm on your side, God says, knowing that I'm going to take you through. And in some ways, that same story plays out for the Christian today. It's a different passage, but like Ephesians, I think it's 1:3, talks about how all the spiritual blessings in the heavenlies have been given to us. I mean, it's all given to us. In Ephesians chapter 3, all we've got to do is claim it. God says every possible spiritual blessing is yours. But in that same book, Ephesians, way back in chapter number 6, we read about taking on the whole armor of God and going out there and claiming the things that God has already promised to us. That tension that we see in Ephesians is the same tension that we see here. So he's got to be strong and courageous. Be careful, he says, to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Don't turn from it to the right or the left, so you can be successful wherever way you go. He says, keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so you can be careful to do everything written in it. And then, and that word then's important, then you'll be prosperous and successful. So God says, I've told you what to do. I've told you what kind of people I want you to be. All the blessings are there. You just got to stay true to your end of the commitment. right? God's made a covenant with us. His end of the covenant is, I'll be with you all of your life. I'll make you succeed. And succeed, this word here, hang on just a second. This word here, successful, keep in mind what God's trying to say here. When we think successful today, usually that involves money. It could involve fame. It might involve how you appear, your looks, or your handsome or beauty, or those kinds of things. Successful with God is your heart will be right. You'll have peace when other people don't have peace. You'll have grace when other people don't have grace. You'll have love and compassion when other people can't muster that up. You'll have hope when they don't have hope. I mean, no matter what goes on the outside, you'll be at peace on the inside. And now this prosperous thing here certainly probably implies comfortable finances, but I don't think like this is a health and wealth kind of thing that as New Testament Christians we should assume that God's always going to do that for us. I think God says, if you put my way first, you're going to be blessed. And I think that's still true. That's still a pretty important verse. Chapter 1, verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Don't be discouraged. I'm going to be with you wherever you go. So God says, trust me in this thing, like he does for all of his heroes, like he did for Moses, like he did for Abraham, like he did for David, and at some level, like he did for Jesus. And yet all of those guys would have moments where they would cry out to God, why have you forsaken me? They might not say it just like that, but that notion that God, I thought this would be easier than it is. There's always that tug, and that's where the strong and courageous stuff comes in. So Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies for Shittim. That's where they're camped out on the other side of the Jordan River. If you can imagine, Jordan River flows down through here, and over here's the Mediterranean Sea, and the Dead Sea is here, and the Sea of Galilee is up here, and Jericho, where they're going to cross, is right there. And so they're camping on this side of it, and they're going to be in a few days heading over to the other side. And so he says, go look over the land, but especially, he says, Jericho. And so they went, the 2 spies did, and they stayed in the house of a prostitute named Rahab. And don't know for sure why they were there. It's possible they were going to a house of a prostitute for the reason that anybody would go to a house of a prostitute. It's also possible that they're going there because it was really close to the wall and it's just the first place they got. But the king of Jericho gets some news about it. Look, some of those Israelites are here. They're come to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent a message to Rahab, you bring out those men who came to you and entered your house, because they've come to spy out the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and she hid them. In a verse or two after that, it's going to say that she tells the king, I think they took off and went across out the way. And the king sends guys out to search for them all around the city. But she says to the spies, I know the Lord has given you this land. I know it. And a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting. And it's really a evocative phrase. They're melting in fear because of you. I mean, it's just an anxiety that's on them day and night. He says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. That's 40 years before this. Today is 2021. 40 years ago was 1981. This stuff that happened when Reagan was president, right? And so we've heard about this stuff. So it was not just something that happened, but it was something that made such an impression on Rahab and on all the other people. Even though it's 40 years ago, we know about you all. We know what kind of people you are, and we're all terrified. Now, it begs the question, and if I can get off just for a second here, it begs the question, if they knew all that, why hadn't they repented? Why hadn't they came over to God's side? If everybody knew that, why didn't they bend their knee to God? And I think, today sometimes a person might say it's not fair for God to judge because he's not given enough evidence. It's not fair for God to judge because he's not given enough proof. Well, how much proof would it take? Raising a man from the dead, would that be enough proof? All the different miracles we see in the Bible, all the ways that this universe seems so perfectly put together. I mean, how much proof would God need? And how much time would it take? For these guys, 40 years wasn't enough. Would 50 years have been enough? Or 70? Or 100? I think for the person who doesn't want to bend their knee, it doesn't matter how long it is. They don't want to bend their knee. And I think God gives us that freedom. It's not for everybody. Not everybody's going to dig it, no matter how much they have opportunity for it. And so she says, when we heard of that, our hearts melted. Again, that phrase, our hearts are melted in fear. And everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven and on the earth below. So she's saying, Rahab the prostitute, hey, I know who I'm dealing with here. And so she says, I want you to swear to me by the Lord that you'll show kindness to my family, because I've shown kindness to you. Give me some sure sign you'll spare the lives of my father and mother and my brothers and sisters and all who belong to him, and you'll save us from death. And the spies say, our lives for your lives. I mean, if you don't tell what we're doing, we'll treat you kindly and faithfully when we come. Rahab becomes a big deal later in the Bible. In Hebrews 11, she's mentioned amongst the great heroes of the faith for this moment. Now, she's still a prostitute. I mean, it wasn't like she was some super saint, right? I mean, her whole career choice kind of takes you away from where God is maybe directing you to go. And it doesn't paint her as somebody who always made all the right moral decisions. But Hebrews 11 says, when push came to shove, she did the right move in faith. James chapter 2 talks about her. It talks about Abraham and her as great examples again of faith. I mean, when Rahab saw the opportunity, she took it. You know, and whatever she had been before that, she left it behind. When she saw the opportunity, she took advantage. There's also one other place in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. It mentions the ancestors of Jesus, and Rahab gets mentioned in that. And there's some Jewish tradition about how that all came to be, but it's her, and everybody who studies Scripture believes that the Rahab there is Rahab. That this woman who was a prostitute eventually becomes one of the great grandparents of Christ. God will bring his son to the world through this woman. She becomes a great hero. And she's evidence for us. You know, we've talked about that tug of war back and forth. God calls, but a lot of times people go the other direction. Rahab's kind of an example of the other thing. God called and she took her chance. When she saw the opportunity, she sold out completely to grab what God had offered. And she's interesting. You could do a longer study just on her. The next day, Joshua told the people, he says, consecrate yourselves, because tomorrow the Lord's going to do amazing things among you. And he told the priests, I want you to take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up, and they went on ahead of them. And when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. And the Jordan, during this stretch, is at flood stage, all during the harvest. Remember, they got to cross this river to get to Jericho. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, and while the water flowing down to the Dead Sea was completely cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Again, I know the maps I'm not doing the best map. Here's the Dead Sea, and here's the Sea of Mediterranean Sea over here, and Jericho's right over here, and they're crossing over, right? This town, Adam, we think is up here someplace, about 20 miles from where they were crossing. So there's some faith even in the crossing, right? God, as soon as the priests touch the water, God stops the stream from flowing. But he doesn't stop it right there like the Red Sea, where they can see water on both sides. But he stops it way up the river, 20 miles up the river. And so they've got to have some faith, those priests. Is God really going to come through? And it's flood stage. It's a little risky to be out there carrying a big, heavy golden box around. I mean, you could be in some trouble, but they trust him and they go out there. And I'm assuming that this, well, it talks about it here in a minute, had an effect on the people of Jericho. And we'll talk about that here in a second. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant stopped in the middle of the Jordan. They stood on dry ground, and all of Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. There's probably close to 1 million Israelites making this journey. At a very small number, of 700,000, 800,000 people making the journey across they're not all soldiers, but it's a big group going across the river, and they all go across on dry ground. It is supposed to evoke in your mind the Red Sea and how Joshua is becoming a new Moses. And remember, the Red Sea miracle 40 years before had freaked Jericho out pretty powerfully. And now you've got this here That day, two things. The Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of their life, just like they had stood in awe of Moses. So the first thing that miracle did is it put Joshua on a different plane with those guys. They realized that, man, the same God who helped Moses is helping him. And it's always God that's the power. It doesn't matter how charismatic the leader is. It's always God that is the real power. But it also had an effect on the Amorite kings, and that's like the king of Jericho. When all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings up along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they crossed over, again, that same phrase, their hearts melted in fear. The same God who 40 years ago was doing miracles is still doing miracles. You know, in 40 years, there's enough space that maybe younger people could think the older people had lied to them. You know, I hear what you're saying about what happened 40 years ago, Dad, but I don't believe that's going to happen now. Well, it's happening again. And the same God who did the miracle then before is doing the miracle again, and it destroys the people of Jericho. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up, and I'm skipping here. We're already to chapter 5. So if you want to go back and read this, there's a lot of other interesting things that happened as they were coming on, but I'm trying to get to Jericho quick as I think I can. In chapter 5, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" "Neither," he said, "but I'm the commander of the army of the Lord, and I have now come." And then Joshua fell face down on the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have?" You know, for Moses, there was a burning bush moment where God spoke to him powerfully. Here, it comes a little different, but it's the same deal. It's the same point and the same. In fact, I don't think I have this verse, but he tells Joshua to take his shoes off. You're on holy ground, the same way Moses had been told that earlier. And so Joshua he sees a guy with a sword. Instead of a burning bush, he sees a guy with a sword, and Joshua doesn't know what to make of it. Or whose side are you on? Joshua says, and the angel basically says, "I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to take charge." And so he's going to start telling Joshua what he has to do. He's going to start laying out for Joshua what Joshua has to do to take care of this battle. And here it is. He says the Lord said. So this commander of the Lord's armies and the Lord are kind of equated together. You see that a lot in the Old Testament, where an angel comes and it's an angel, but he's speaking for God. And there's other times where you're not sure if the angel might actually be God, and it's mysterious. And you're seeing that same kind of thing here. We're not sure exactly what's going on. There's some who even argued this could be like a foreshadowing of Jesus, and maybe. I think it's probably an angel speaking for God. It says, "The Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. And here's the plan. I want you to march around the city once with all the armed men, and do that every day for 6 days. On the seventh day, I want you to march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing their trumpets. And when you hear them blow a loud blast on the trumpet, have the whole army give a shout, and the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in.'" Now remember, again, this army, several tens of thousands of troops, right? It's not maybe even a couple 100,000 people who might be part of the army, right, in this deal. And so when they're at this city, they're going to be all around the city. When they're marching around, it's not going to be like 10 guys marching. They're going to circle the city, and they're pretty much going to be around all the city at the same time as they're marching. But everyone's going to go straight in. So the walls are not going to crumble and crack gradually. They're going to fall in. It's just going to completely come down to dust, and you're going to go straight in. You won't have to go around. Everybody's going to be able to take it quickly. It'll be obvious it was a miracle. And they did that. They go and do the thing that they're told to do, and they do it for 6 days. So for 6 days, every morning, the people got up and they marched one time around the city. Joshua told them not to say anything. Be as quiet as you can. So there's a psychological warfare element to this going on here. And as a military strategy, I'm sure it had a big effect on the people of Jericho. They're already frightened, right? They're already scared. They're putting their trust in their wall to save them. But they're already frightened and they're already scared. You can picture the army approaching the front gate and all the Jericho troops getting to the front gate, and then the soldier on the top says, "Well, they're not stopping. They're going around the city." And so maybe the army inside the walls are just following them, right? We know you're going to come here, and we'll be ready. And so the army inside is circling the walls too, and they do that for 7 days. 7 days, the army inside is paralleling the army outside. Everybody's scared as they can be. The war's about to start, but nothing for 6 days. On the 7th day, he says they got up at daybreak and they marched around the city, except on that day, they marched around 7 times. So again, that same picture, right? The guys start to march, and the inside the wall, probably the Jericho army is matching them best they can. And as they get through once, maybe the soldiers inside say, okay, wow, it's over. And the guy on the top, the watchman, says, oh no, they're going around again. And so this time for 7 times, and they're ready for this big battle. Whatever weak parts you're going to want to stab. The Israelites, I think this is an example of great faith here too, because the Israelites are strictly taking God's word for it. They're strictly taking God's word for it. God says he'll bring the walls down. Now, we don't know how big the walls of Jericho was. There's been a lot of archaeology over there, and there's some reason to think maybe the walls did. But it's a city that's been built and rebuilt through the years. It's one of the first cities in that part of the world. And the walls were probably pretty thick, and the wall, we don't know for sure, but probably, Rahab sees this coming, and she wants out. She sees what's going on, and she wants to switch sides. But most of the Jericho people thought their wall would be tough enough. Most of the Jericho people thought they could survive this thing, that Israel wouldn't be able to get through their wall. And so for 7 days, they march around. I would imagine some of the people, the psychological warfare part of it was really freaking them out inside the wall. Maybe some other guys were wanting to give in when they saw the size of Israel's army and they knew about the miracle working stuff that had went on before. But they never give in. They just keep waiting. But for the Israelites, it must have been a pretty hard wait too, right? For the Israelites, for 7 days they march around and they just don't see even one crack in the wall. For all evidence, every time they've marched around, it hasn't done any good at all. My kids used to have a VeggieTales video, and they have a VeggieTales story about this. And in the VeggieTales story, the guards on the wall are laughing at the people down below. You're never going to get us. And I don't know if that happened or not, but you wonder if there was a moment when they were starting to really wonder, okay, is God really going to come through? And it wasn't like they hadn't seen God come through. They just come through the Jordan River, right? They know God can do miracles. But they just keep trusting him. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, the Lord's given you the city. And they took everything. They all went straight in. The walls came down just like God said they would, and they took everything. And didn't just take it, they destroyed it all. They made the city kind of like a sacrifice. They couldn't say that they profited off of it. They gave it all back to God. Everything that they could burn, they burned. Everything that wouldn't burn went into the temple of the Lord, and they didn't keep it into the tabernacle. Joshua spared Rahab and her family and all who belonged to her because she'd hit the spies. It says she lives amongst the Israelites after that. She became a part of their community. She wasn't an outsider. She was adopted right into their group. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. So I want to things start turning here in Joshua chapter 7, and I want to kind of focus on that and think through that for a minute. I think that's interesting. Jericho is one of the high points in the Bible. I told you at the very beginning, you see this back and forth with God's people, and there's a lot of stories like that. There's a story about Elijah, and Elijah calls fire down, and it's like his highest moment. But it makes him an outlaw, and the next moment, it seems like a day or two later, he's begging God to kill him because he can't take it anymore. And you see this power of God and the frailty of people and how those two things kind of intersect, right? And sometimes it intersects because we don't think we can do it. Like God, in his great power, told a guy named Barak to go and fight for him. And Barak says he won't do it unless Deborah goes with him. She was one of God's prophetesses, kind of like I was a judge, kind of like a prophet. And I won't do it unless she goes with me. And so you see the strength of God and the weakness then of people. And that's what's going on here. But here it's a sin issue. God says, I'm going to give you the city of Jericho. It all comes back to me. So you're going to have your lives. You're going to have a great military victory, but you're not going to get rich because of Jericho. That's not the point. The point of Jericho is for God to be revealed as the king, and not the strength of Israel's army. But it says the Israelites were unfaithful. This guy Achan, he took some stuff. Later it's going to mention he took a robe and some silver and a big chunk of gold, buried it in his tent. But it doesn't say that. But Achan was unfaithful. It says, but the Israelites were unfaithful. Now you would think that maybe the guy writing this has got that wrong, but that's not how this works. I mean, when one part of the body suffers, 1 Corinthians 12, 1 Corinthians 12. When one part of the body suffers, we all suffer with it. When one part of the body is exalted and lifted up, we're all lifted up with it. And Achan's sin bleeds into the whole community because of what Achan does. One guy out of a million, one guy out of a million keeps a robe, a little bit of silver and some gold, and it reflects on everybody. So Joshua sent some men from Jericho to Ai, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36. Jericho was a giant city for that time. Ai is just a little bitty village, basically. They've got a wall, but they're not nearly as big or intimidating. But the men of Ai fought them back, and they killed 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries. We have no idea where that's at. And they struck them down the slope. And at this, it's Israel now who melts in fear. That same phrase, right? Because all of Israel's confidence was in God's power. It was God's power that was freaking out Jericho, and it was God's power that was lifting up the Israelites. And now it looks like God has backed away. Again, 36 people die because of one man's sin. One guy makes a mistake and it bleeds out and affects everybody. I don't think it is an exact one-to-one parallel between the Old Testament and the New Testament on this. However, God hasn't changed, and Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think even today, the sin of one person has a way of bleeding out in ways that are hard to calculate into the whole church. It's easy to see that if the one person who's really making mistakes is a leader. And I'm not talking about we all sin, right? I mean, we're all doing stupid things all the time. But it's that hidden sin. It's that sin that you know is wrong. You know it's the wrong thing to do. It's not like you were caught in a bad moment and did something stupid. It's not like before you knew it, you said the wrong thing. It's that calculated decision. And even if it's not calculated to do it, it's calculated to hide it. And you don't let God have this one section of your life, right? I mean, God, I'm completely yours except for this one section, and that's mine, God, and you can't have it. And that one sin like that bleeds out. And 36 families, I mean, not just 36 people, but 36 families are forever changed because of one guy's mistake, because God pulls his blessing back. And doesn't just pull his blessing back, but seems to actively curse the Israelites. Jericho was under, they called it being under the ban. Jericho was under the ban. Everything was destroyed because Achan kept some of this stuff. Israel now is under the ban. There's a Disney movie, the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Black Pearl, has that same kind of, they have the coins in that one. If you have the coin, then you're under that same curse, and you've got to get all the coins back. It's like that, but that's magic, and this is God and it's relationship, right? God says, as long as we're in relationship, I'm on your side and you're on mine. But if you opt out of the relationship, God says, then I'm going to opt out too. And again, we live in a grace era because of Jesus, and it's not a one-to-one comparison. But there's things here that you can see God's character, and it's worth meditating on. It's worth thinking about. Anyway, Joshua didn't need to think about it. It says he tears his clothes, which was a way to really show grief in that time period. Tears his clothes, fell face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and he stayed there until evening. The elders of Israel did the same, and they sprinkled dust on their heads. And all that is a way to say, I'm nothing, I'm the bottom, God, I'm just terrible. And but the Lord says to Joshua, stand up. And I kind of take it, I don't think God has human features exactly like we do, but if he does have human features, like I think God's even probably rolling his eyes here. It doesn't say rolling his eyes, but in my head, when I picture this idea, what are you doing? What are you doing on your feet? Israel sinned, God says. They violated the covenant I commanded them to keep. They've kept some of the devoted things. They've stolen. They've lied, and they've put them with their own possessions, and that's why you can't beat your enemies. You'll turn your backs and run because I've made you liable to destruction. The Jericho had been liable to destruction. It was banned, and now you are. And I'll not be with you anymore. This is going to be it. I'll not be with you anymore unless you destroy what's among you that was devoted to destruction. This really could be the end of the whole ride, depending on what happens next. God says, I'm not going to put, and it does kind of beg the question. We're talking about a robe, a little bit of silver, and some gold. Is God really going to just completely stop the whole thing because of a robe and a little bit of silver? So it deserves a little bit of explanation, if you'll bear with me. Part of it is the context. It's the time. He has just brought the walls of Jericho down. The pillar of cloud is still sitting on top of the tabernacle. They still can look and see where God is. That's not went away yet, I don't think. The robe and the silver and the gold, yeah, they're just trivial little things, but it's all being done in this context where God is so powerfully visible in front of the people. He's parted the Jordan River. They walked across on dry ground. He's doing miracles among them every moment. And in that context, when God has given everything, and it's so obvious that he's there, and it's so obvious that it's in that context that Achan takes these things. So it's a fantastic departure of faith. It's not some little trivia thing, and the context matters. I'm not saying that to steal now is no big deal to God, big deal to him, not a big deal now. I'm not saying that. It's still a big deal. And stealing thing, that's actually something here too. Remember the slide before that? They've stolen, he says. They've lied. You'll recognize those as part of the 10 Commandments, right? These are the big things. And it's important to remember that the big things are the 10 Commandments. The big things are the big things for a reason. These are the things that get right at the heart of what we are to one another. And so they've stolen. God says, that city was mine. And you took some of those things, and it was mine. It wasn't yours to keep. So you've stolen. Actually, the New Testament story that kind of pops up in the same way is Ananias and Sapphira, and it's Acts chapter 5. You can look that one up later, but in that story, Ananias and Sapphira, they sell a piece of ground, and they take the money they made, and they say, here's all the money we made on this ground, and they offer that to the church, but it wasn't all the money. They'd kept a lot of it back, and they said they were given everything, but they weren't. And Peter says, you're lying to God. And in that story, too, we don't know how much money it was even. It doesn't say. It could have been $5 or $500 or $5,000. We don't know how much money they kept back. They just kept back some, but they lied and said they gave it to all. You're not lying to us, Peter says. You're lying to God. And in that Acts chapter 5 story, both of them, Ananias and Sapphira, they both are killed. God kills them. The people don't do it. They just drop dead right then, because it's a big deal to lie to God when it is so obvious that he's moving. I don't know if I've explained that good enough or not, but that's part of why he reacts here like he does. This is gigantic. Most of the time we operate on a lot of faith. I can't look out the window and have some clear, obvious representation that God is watching over my house right now. A lot of that I have to take on faith. I can't hear God's voice speaking. Well, the same way that even in this verse here, the quotes here is God who's talking to Joshua. I can't get God, I can't get an audible voice like that. It's how I relate to God now and how they related then. God lets me move in faith a lot more. He puts his Holy Spirit in my heart, and he lets me move in faith. But the context matters. Here, he is so overwhelming, and because they cave here, I'm not going to put up with it. So, then Joshua, together with all Israel, they take Achan, the son of Zerah, and they take the silver and the robe and the gold bar. But not just that, they take his sons and his daughters, his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, everything he had to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord's going to trouble you today." And it says they stoned him. All of them did, and stoned all of it, and burned them, and put a big pile of rocks, and then the Lord turned from his fierce anger. One thing about some of these Old Testament stories, especially compared to the stories about Jesus in the New Testament, is they can be kind of bloody. It's not like Jesus, the story about Jesus doesn't have any blood in it. I mean, it's the blood of Christ that makes everything happen. But you don't see, in fact, there's one place where Jesus is asked, should we stone this woman? And Jesus seems to go the other direction, that the era for that is changed. And so some people have a problem with that. I mean, it seems like God here is so much more intense than the difference is Jesus. Jesus is the difference. Here, we have no Redeemer. We're just hanging by a thread onto God. God is completely righteous, and we're completely broken, and any one of us at any moment can be stupid. Here, judgment falls down swift and hard, and sometimes bloody. But that's not to say that God has completely changed from that. The Christian story says that there's a day coming for us too, one day when God's going to judge all the people. There will be a day, one day, when we all have to stand before the throne of God and give some sort of an account of ourselves. And if the Bible is to be believed, more people than not are not going to be able to survive that and move on with God into heaven. More people than not are going to be on a wider road that goes away from God. It's that judgment day that we see here with all the ugliness of it, that's still coming, because God is righteous, and only the people who are willing to stand in his righteousness can approach him. Now, Jesus, of course, makes it possible for even the knuckleheads to come close to God now. Because of Jesus, there's grace and forgiveness when we cheat or lie or steal or do dumb things. Because of Jesus, we can ask Christ for forgiveness and grace, and it says he always supplies that. That he always provides wisdom to those who ask him, says James, and that he's a faithful high priest who knows what we're going through because he's been tempted in the same way himself. Somebody we can approach with confidence in our time of need is what Hebrews says. It's Jesus that gives us a hope out of the judgment that we surely deserve. So that's Joshua. When you think about the story of Joshua and you think about what it's all about, what are the lessons here for us? Well, there's a couple. First of all, I hope, like Rahab, you see that no matter who you are and no matter what you've done, the door's open. You just got to turn to God. I mean, no matter who you are and no matter what you've done, it's God who's the power. And even if you're following some great super saint, like Joshua, he has to follow Moses. I mean, that had to be intimidating as he's standing in front of the people. How am I going to take over for that guy? It's not about you. It's never been about you. It's about God and whether or not you're willing to hold on to him. I hope you also see a little bit out of Achan's story, something for us to consider, how the sin of one person has a debilitating effect on the whole community, even if the whole community is not even aware of it. And they weren't aware of what Achan did when they went up to attack Ai. I mean, they weren't. And sometimes there's real-world consequences. The sin of one person has a way of bleeding out. And you've probably seen that, right? I mean, even in your own family, something's not quite right in your life, and that anger leaches out to your spouse, to your kids, or that regret or that guilt, or that it just leaches out. It hangs a shadow over everything. And really sin does that. And until it's confessed and until you get it out in the open, it has a lot of power. Sin has much more power in the darkness than it ever does in the light. And I hope you see that too, how powerful that all is. I hope you get some glimpse of the judgment, because that's all through Joshua. You see it with Jericho and the judgment that they fall under, that Rahab and all of them are so frightened of. You see it with the judgment against Achan there at the end. And then one last thing. I hope you see that the promises of God that he gives us, he still expects us to work for it. The gift is there. He's going to be with us either way, and he's going to do most of the work himself, but he wants us to take steps. He wants us to march. He wants us to be the people that we're supposed to be. And I don't think that's totally gone away in the New Testament era. We're not saved by our works. The Bible's very clear about that. But that's not to suggest that God doesn't want us to work or that God doesn't want us to do something. I think you see that a bunch in the Bible. He lays out the promise, and then you have to go claim it. It's all there. I mean, you're going to win, but you've got to go do it. David will beat that giant, but he's still got to stand in front of him. And that promise and that premise you see over and over and over again. So I hope you get some glimpse of that too, because I think that's important. And the Israelites, for what it's worth, they never totally do take it over. The promised land, when the specifications are laid out there, it's about 300,000 acres is what God promises to them. They only take over about 30,000 acres before they start getting tired. 30,000 square acres. They aren't able to claim it all. It's there. They just get tired of fooling with it. And it leads to all sorts of other problems. All right, well, that's it. Like I said, none of our groups are meeting tonight, and we hate that. But we're praying for you, and if this helped you tonight, I hope it did. And sorry about all the technical difficulties. We're still trying to figure all that out. Next week, if you are in the groups, we're encouraging the groups to do service-type projects. And please call Gabe or call me, and we'll help you get started if you need some ideas of what to do there next. But there won't be a lesson next week. Next week, take 1 week off for the lesson, and we'll come back in 2 weeks. And Ruth is our next thing. All right. We'll see you.